The smell of smoke and a bank of haze that moved into Ontario.
It's one of the worst air qualities ever recorded.
They say being outside is like smoking 3 to 11 cigarettes a day.
The more pollutants in the air, the worse quality air people are up against. Unfortunately, near 10 million acres burned, which is well above what's normal for them in an average wildfire season. Now,
air quality advisories remain in effect.
Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing. Okay, ready?
Welcome to Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
optimal
wellness brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
Jess, when's the first time you thought of the health effects of wildfire smoke?
2 days ago.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. We keep getting these emails. My daughter's volleyball practice was canceled. Outdoor recess. Now they're doing indoor recess.
I think all school boards have done that, actually.
Things are happening, and it's because of wildfire, which in the Midwest, we record this in Toronto. This has been something that we've been privileged not to have had to confront.
Right.
Until now.
Yeah. Despite the fact that there are wildfires in Canada every year, this year they're particularly bad and the smoke is affecting us. Like I can smell the smoke in the air and I can see it. It's affecting us directly kind of right away. And that's also something that's, I think, scaring people a little bit.
There's a lot of hype around this. Should sports matches actually be canceled? What can we do to protect ourselves? Should we just be, staying inside? Is it another era of shelter in place?
Get our masks out again?
Or is this all overblown?
Or hopefully it'll just blow over. I'm Jasmine Ratch.
I'm Chris Shulgin. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think. And in this episode, we're talking about the health effects of wildfire smoke.
Yeah, we talked to a couple of experts. We talked to a respirologist and also he happens to be Medcan's clinical director of sleep. His name is Dr. Chris Chan.
And we also have Dr. Stephanie Holm. She's an MD, PhD. She's an expert in occupational and environmental medicine. She's written widely on the health effects of wildfire smoke. And she's the co-director of the University of California, San Francisco's Western States Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit.
She and Dr. Chris Chan are going to break down how exactly wildfire smoke can affect our health, what do we need to do to stay safe both when we're inside and outside, and how can you mitigate the effects of wildfire smoke if you do happen to breathe some of it in. So now let's bring in the experts, Dr. Chris Chan and Dr. Stephanie Holm. First, we asked them why exactly wildfire smoke is so bad for our health. Here's Dr. Chris Chan.
So, of course, the wildfires produce a lot of smoke. And these smoke contain many gas and particles, and these gas certainly could be detrimental to our health. Some of these chemicals, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, ozone, volatile organic compounds, and fine particulate matters. If these particles get into our lungs and bloodstream, it can produce a wide range of symptoms and disease condition. Some of these symptoms can be very mild, such as having a headache or a slight cough and increased sputum production. It can irritate our eyes, our nose, and our throat. A little bit more serious symptoms that could include chest pain, palpitation, shortness of breath, dizziness, severe cough, and even wheezing. For those patients who have obstructive lung disease, such as asthma and COPD, certainly they could get an acute exacerbation of their COPD or develop an asthma attack. More serious medical complication could include a stroke and a heart attack, and the most extreme, of course, even death.
And here's Dr. Stephanie Holm.
Wildfire smoke contains a number of air pollutants, including some that exist in other things as well, right? So we're all exposed to traffic-related air pollution and air pollution from industries, and those things have particulate matter, right? So really small dust particles that are bad for you. They have gases like nitrogen dioxide and ozone, and wildfire smoke contains all of those same things. So it's air pollutants that we know are bad for us, in other kinds of settings, and they also exist in wildfire smoke. There are also some more unique things that occur in wildfire smoke, certainly when things like structures and vehicles and other man-made things are burning. You can have all kinds of volatile organic compounds. There was a study in California a couple of years ago that airborne lead levels were actually really high after one of the fires. Again, probably related to burning of man-made things. So it's, sort of all of those things that we know are bad from regular air pollution, plus some others as well. So it's sort of a nasty mixture of stuff.
And so when we do breathe all of that stuff in, does it just go into our lungs, or is it flowing kind of through our whole body? What's happening once we do breathe it in?
So you breathe it in, some of it, lands in your nose, some in your throat, some in your lungs, some in really deep in your lungs. And the very, very smallest particles can also go from your lungs into your bloodstream and go throughout your body. So yes, some of the pollution is actually directly going through all parts of your body, but even the stuff that ends up just in your lungs, the response to that, the like inflammation and irritation that happens in your body in response to that, that can have effects all throughout the body, not just in the lungs, even if the pollution itself stays in the lungs. So it's both. There's a lot in your lungs, but there are a lot of effects across the body as well.
And so there is a big difference then between inhaling wildfire smoke and the smoke that you would inhale if you're sitting around a campfire. This is a different beast, you're saying, than that kind of smoke.
This is somewhat of a different beast. I think the other issue is that, if you are cooking around a campfire, you'll probably adjust and move yourself sort of naturally out of the main plume of the smoke. And so you often, especially if you're in an outdoor space, won't get exposed to the same level of pollution. Certainly, if you're cooking over an open flame in a smaller space, as many people do in various parts of the world, because that's what they have for cooking, you can certainly reach really high indoor PM 2.5. That's the particulate matter that's smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter, small stuff that gets deep in your lungs. That can get really high. So it is probably a bit more toxic than a lot of the smoke that people have been exposed to over the years. But it's also that, you're just getting these higher doses and higher amounts of exposure.
So I have seen headlines, things like spending a certain amount of hours outside is the equivalent of like smoking 6 cigarettes. Can you break down what that ratio is?
So it's really hard to break down what that ratio is. And I'll be honest, that's partially because they're in some ways very different things. Some ways they're very similar, right? A lot of the gases that are produced in cigarette smoke, a lot of that is also particulate matter, right? So that's very similar. Of course, unless there's like nicotine fields burning, wildfire smoke is not going to have nicotine in it, right? So that's a different thing. I will say that, folks have done some work to suggest that something on the ballpark of having a few cigarettes, 3, 4, something like that, is like being in what in the US we would call the unhealthy air quality index. We use the AQI rather than the AQHI, like you guys, that it's like being in that for a full 24 hours. But I can tell you things that you can do to decrease your exposure today, knowing that you had that exposure yesterday.
I would love to hear.
One of the best things folks can do is work with their family to create a cleaner indoor air space if they can. That means having a space where you have ventilation and filtration that's filtering out the particles as best you can. So if you have central heat and central air conditioning, you want to get a filter for that has what's called a MERV, M-E-R-V, minimum efficiency rating value, a MERV rating of 13 or higher. And that's because those are the ones that really filter out the small particles, those ones that can get deep into your lungs. You can also use portable air cleaners. Sometimes people call these air purifiers. I don't like to call them purifiers because it's not actually purifying anything, but it is filtering your air. And so those can help as well. You want to stick with the ones that use mechanical filtration. So literally have like a HEPA filter and the air passes through it, not the ones that use ionizers or some sort of electrostatic. Some of those can actually produce air pollutants. So you're then getting rid of some and making others, which you don't want to do. So stick with the mechanical kind. There's also been some efforts from folks looking at do-it-yourself air cleaners. We don't know a whole lot about sort of in the long term how well those perform, but there are folks that have looked at them in short-term settings, and you can certainly decrease smoke exposure levels quite a bit using those. So those basically you buy the same kind of MERV 13 rated filters I was talking about previously, and secure those together with a box fan. So you're pushing air through those filters. The other thing that you can do is if you have to be outside, wearing a mask or a respirator. Here in the States, the ones that I always recommend are the NIOSH certified N95 masks. And that's because those seal really tightly to the face. They tend to have head straps rather than the ear loops. And so you're getting a much tighter seal. Sometimes that makes them less comfy. People don't like them as well because it's pushing on your face, but that's a good thing, right? It's pushing on there so particles aren't getting around the edges.
We also got Dr. Chris Chan's recommendations on how to mitigate the health effects caused by wildfire smoke.
So the most important strategy, of course, is to avoid or reduce exposure to outdoor air pollution. So I would suggest that everyone to be familiar with their air quality in their neighborhood. So you can do so by just following the local health officials' warnings and guidelines, and also check the Air Quality Health Index. So the Air Quality Health Index, if the number is between 1 to 3, that's low risk. 3 to 6 is moderate risk. 7 to 10 is high risk. And if it's greater than 10 is a very high risk. And if the outdoor air quality is very poor, certainly you would want to stay indoor as much as possible. And when you're indoor, you want to close the door and close the window and make sure the indoor space have good ventilation. And ideally with air filters in place. And also just stay well hydrated. If you develop any symptoms, immediately seek medical attention. If you have to go outside, then try to avoid overexert yourself.
Next, we wanted to know how exactly the air quality inside is different from the air quality outside. Won't the risks be the same inside as they are outside?
So interesting question. Of course, currently we're talking about the wildfire in the forest. The source of the air pollution is outdoor. So by being as far away as possible from the source of the pollution, and also by staying indoor from reducing the exposure to the outside air, so we're less chance of being exposed to these noxious gases and particles. So there's less chance for you to develop symptoms and medical complication. This question also brings up something that's often overlooked, which is the indoor air quality. So for example, if you're in an indoor space where people smoke, certainly the air quality could be very poor. And if you're in an older building, potentially there's a radon exposure or carcinogen from certain cleaning chemicals, or the building could have asbestos or molds. So certainly indoor air quality would be equally important.
So really good question, and one that comes down to a lot of nitty gritty details that I probably can't tell you without knowing things about your building. So in many cases, there is some decrease, and I know that's very vague, in the smoke exposures indoors compared to outdoors, just being inside, even if you don't have any filtration. That being said, it's related a lot to things like how leaky the building envelope is, how tight the joints are in the walls and all of that kind of stuff that aren't, I can't tell you for my house exactly how tight my building envelope is. It's probably not very. I live in a house built in the 1940s. So it's hard to know. And I think the other thing is that people, sometimes the gut reaction is if you're going to be inside, they want to really seal up all of the spaces, saran wrap your house and then you won't let smoke in. But the problem with that is, hey, there are things that we do indoors that create pollution, right? Cooking creates pollution. Vacuuming can create pollution because it tosses stuff up into the air. I think, if you're not sure whether your indoor space at home has a substantial decrease in the smoke, if you're able to get to a public space that does, often it's places like local libraries, sometimes shopping malls. And so certainly if you have folks in your family who are at particularly high risk, people with lung diseases, young kids, elderly family members, if you can go spend some time in one of those cleaner air places, do that.
And speaking of people who are at high risk, we asked both the experts who needs to be the most careful during a wildfire smoke event.
Usually people who have a lower immunity or decreased cardiopulmonary reserve would be the most vulnerable to breathing in air pollution. So seniors, children, pregnant women, patients who have chronic cardiopulmonary disease, or patients who's on chemotherapy for cancer or diabetes even, these would be the more vulnerable. Outdoor workers, especially those workers who does a lot of strenuous activities. Since they have a higher exposure to poor air quality, they're certainly at higher risk to develop symptoms and a medical complication as well.
Pregnant people and children are both actually at particularly high risk. And that's because in both cases, they breathe more air relative to their body size. In pregnant people, that's because their metabolism is really high to support this growth, right? There's the massive growth happening within them. And so they breathe a lot of air. And so they're getting in a higher dose of the air pollution. It's sort of like exercising all the time, right? Just being pregnant is that extra work. And so you're breathing in more. And kids also breathe more relative to their body size than adults. And so the way I often like to say it is if I'm sitting right next to a child, we're in the same space, we're breathing the same air, that kid still gets a higher relative dose of air pollution compared to me because they're breathing faster relative to their body size.
And so for the rest of us who are going to inevitably inhale some smoke, we are at risk of developing certain conditions like asthma or other lung conditions. What else are we at risk for when we breathe in the air when it's this poor quality?
We have a lot of information about the risks of long-term exposures to air pollution. We have a lot of information about the short-term risks of short-term exposures to air pollution, right? So like when the air pollution goes up, it's much more likely that people show up in emergency rooms with breathing problems, with heart attacks, all of that kind of stuff. What we don't have a lot of good information about is when you're exposed to a single or a couple really high exposures for a short time, what that means for the long term. So we can sort of, use some critical thinking and put together from what we do know. And from what we know in other air pollution studies, certainly, exposures are related to development of asthma, exacerbation. So if you already have asthma, a higher chance of more asthma attacks, as people often call them. It's also related to things like obesity and metabolic effects. So changes in things like blood pressure and lipids in your body. And then air pollution is also cancer causing. So the International Agency on Research for Cancer, which is called IARC, they have designated particulate matter, PM2.5, as a carcinogen. It contributes to lifelong risk of cancer. And so, we would expect that any of these exposures to particulate matter slightly increase your risk of cancers later in life. Can I tell you exactly how much? No. Do you need to panic that the sky was orange yesterday? No, right? But it's a reason to just do what you can to take steps to decrease your exposure and decrease the exposure to your kids.
So, Stephanie, these are important protocols we should be all starting to put into place. Is this something we should be doing for the foreseeable future? Are there certain times in the day where we should be extra precautious? Like, what's the timeline here, both within one day and sort of for the foreseeable future?
I work with a lot of great people who have been thinking about and working on wildfire smoke for a long time. And one of the things that the wildfire smoke public health community has really started to talk about is being smoke ready, right? So it's no longer a question of if we're going to have wildfire smoke events, it's when, right? They're going to happen. Certainly they can happen at a whole variety of times. They're much more likely to happen in the summer. And so if you think about the summer as wildfire season, getting things ready, right? Making sure you have those MERV 13 filters that'll fit in your system and a backup so you can trade it out. Stocking up on portable air filters if you need them. Stocking up on N95 masks that fit your family. And then, whatever you can do within your local community to advocate for having public spaces that can be cleaner air shelters.
And then what time of day is the smoke usually the worst? Is there a time or is it really just random?
It's pretty random. And the reason it's pretty random is that there are a lot of factors that go into how much smoke you're exposed to at a single place. That includes things like, certainly where the smoke is coming from, right? What's burning, what direction the wind is going, some sort of local climatic factors, because just like, all kinds of different things in our atmosphere, gases react with each other. And so, what exactly makes it to your location 20, 30, 40 minutes away from wherever the fire is happening, or 4 hours away from the fire is happening, is going to depend on the wind direction and everything else happening in between. And so it's really hard to predict. There are a number of resources, that can show you what the patterns of smoke look like. We have, which I know has some data within Canada too, sort of on the southern border. We have a fire and smoke map that the Environmental Protection Agency puts together. It's at fire.airnow.gov. And it combines information from government sensors as well as some information from the lower cost air sensors that sometimes individuals buy and put in their homes or businesses. So I can see data in Vancouver and in Calgary and Edmonton and Regina and in Toronto and Quebec. And there's not a whole lot further north, but there's some there that could be useful. And it's pretty nice because it shows you some of the spatial variability. If you're going one direction versus another, which way is safer. I like to always say, if I'm taking my kid to the park, can I look on the map and see, do I go to the park on the east side of town or the west side of town, right? Is there anywhere where there's less smoke? Then that can be helpful.
Just starting to train yourself to think about these things also, I think maybe this week will sort of kickstart that in all of us for the rest of the summer.
It's a little interesting for those of us out here in California who have been very used to dealing with wildfire smoke for a number of years now. And, there's something really visceral about seeing it happen to your kids and your family and your friends. And so I think, in some ways, this is the wake-up call on the eastern half of the US and Canada that many of us out west have been sort of waiting for you all to see. Not that we wanted you to see it, right? But for folks to realize how important and how problematic this is.
And so for one more thing before we go, do you have any sort of surprising or interesting thing that you've come across in your research that you don't think people would know about when it comes to wildfire smoke?
I will say this is a little bit from left field, or is going to feel a little bit from left field for you, I think. But I do a lot of work on cooking related pollution as well. And I think people are often really surprised to see that you can actually get air pollutant levels in your home from cooking that are as high as some of these wildfire smoke levels. And so that's one way that you can decrease your exposure overall on a regular basis, is by ventilating better during cooking. And I'll say we at the Western States PACU, where I work, have done a lot of work putting together educational materials for families and also for health providers. Our webpage is wspehsu.ucsf.edu. And we have a whole page of wildfire resources. It has information on masking. It has information on tips for families. A lot of the stuff you and I just talked about, we've got nice little graphics. So I definitely recommend people check that out. Those are, just there for the general good. So please use them.
Don't worry, we'll include links to these resources that Dr. Holm just mentioned, as well as all the other websites or studies referenced throughout the episode on our show notes.
It can be really scary when there are big smoke events happening, and I totally get that. I have also lived through them. I would encourage folks to just, do what you can to get into a cleaner airspace, take some deep breaths, but also try and maintain routines as much as you can. It can be really stressful. And if, life is getting really disrupted, that can contribute as well. So hang in there. There are actions you can take. It'll be okay. The wind direction will change and there will be a clearer day coming soon. You know how to prepare now. Do that for the next time.
Amazing. Well, this has been very informative and helpful. So thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Stephanie Holm.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to help, Jasmine.
And thank you for dropping by and sharing your expertise, Dr. Chris Chan.
I wish everybody stays safe out there. Thank you.
That was Clinical Director of Medcan's Sleep Program, Dr. Chris Chan, who's also a respirologist and an ICU MD.
As well as Dr. Stephanie Holm, who's an MD PhD and an expert in occupational environmental medicine out of University of California, San Francisco.
You can follow Dr. Stephanie Holm on Twitter at Steph_Holm, that's STEPH_HOLM, and follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLiveWell.
We'll post episode highlights and other links you can visit on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
And check out our YouTube channel at Medcan Live Well for lots of other videos and resources.
Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. I'm Jasmine Ratch, managing producer.
I'm executive producer Christopher Shulgin.
Social media and strategy support is from Chantel Gertin, Andrew Imix, and Emily Bozick.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast episode is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with any specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.